My name is Irin Poellot, and I currently live in Life Care Center, Longmont, Colorado. I was born in a little area near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a little area called Clifton, and then my parents moved to an area of western Pennsylvania called 84. You may have traveled that part of the country and seen 84 Lumber Company. It was first begun in that little town. That's why it's called 84 Lumber. The high school I went to was a small one in a very sophisticated part of a little town called Washington, Pennsylvania. My father was a carpenter, worked with his hands all his life. My mother stayed home, took care of the house, raised me, and the only other interest she had was the piano. She played it well, and for a small, short time, she taught piano at home and enjoyed that very much. She felt like she was doing something extra and felt very good about it. My grandparents, it's very familiar. My mother's parents were from Ireland, and my father's parents and family were from Germany. I find that mixture quite a lot. My grandparents were first generation to the United States. I think they came over separately, and I believe that they came first to Canada and then down to the western Pennsylvania area. Difficult to think whether we traveled very much. There were no real vacations as people know them today. There wasn't money to do that, so we had to make do with vacations at home. And we did that pretty well because I didn't feel being cheated by not having long vacations in other places. I did have one trip. It was with my parents, and that was to Lake Erie, and it was very brief. I think long enough to put our toes in the water and then come back home. We didn't explore a whole lot, but it was nice to travel that far with my parents for the first time. I'm thinking about the work that my father did as a carpenter, and there is not, I saw several houses that he had built, but with other workers. He did build the house in which I grew up. He built the building first as a little chicken coop with plans to build a bigger house in front of this little chicken coop. But what happened is that the chicken coop grew larger, and we lived in that house for all the time that I was growing up and in college and in working. And the chicken coop developed in another area of the property. So by the end, we had 3 chicken coops and 1 house. My mother was primarily a homemaker, yes, but her other talents were playing the piano and teaching that short time that she did it. She was an awfully good cook, and she was a very good sewer. I wore homemade clothes all through my childhood and all through high school until my senior year. And I said, please, Mom, can I have a store-bought dress for the senior prom? It seemed right to have a dress for the senior prom. It came from a store. So she let me buy a dress in the store. Went to the senior prom, and there were 3 other dresses just like it at the senior prom. So I learned that by having a homemade dress, I had something that no one else wore. And I learned a good lesson, and I'm sure my mother is still chuckling about that wherever she may be. I was the only child growing up at home. My father had been married before, and he and his wife had gone to Florida where he could find work. but they were there long enough to have 3 children, so I guess he found some work. Um, and then they moved back to the Pittsburgh area, and she passed away. So I was born of his second marriage. Everything happened at church. We were very tight Presbyterian, didn't much accept other religions as very important. I was really active as a Sunday school teacher and at church camps in summers. Actually, at one point, considered that I might go to a seminary and become a minister. I'm really very grateful I didn't do that. My life turned out quite differently, and I liked the way it ran. The Presbyterian Church is all I've ever been involved with as far as a religious education is concerned. Sunday school and teaching Sunday school as well. You learn a lot doing that. Thinking about becoming a minister didn't even occur to me that my being a woman might be a problem doing that. I had already known some women in the seminary and felt very close to them and really appreciated their lives and thought that I might be able to do that. I was very close to a woman who was a director of Christian education. And that's the direction a lot of women took in those days. If they were going to become involved in the church teaching or preaching, they would do it through Christian education, which in some cases was probably better than preaching. I don't think I accepted the teachings of the church wholeheartedly, but I did not really realize that for a long time. I embraced them. I thought it was giving me all that I needed, but as I grew older, I found that there was something lacking, something more that I needed, and I found that through Subud. I don't know that I would think of myself as a seeker. I've never been able to explore or study things very deeply, so I did not study other religions. It was just something that I had to feel inside myself. I went to Muskingum College, which is in southern Ohio. I went there because my mother wanted me to go there. She had gone on a Christian Endeavor trip one summer when she was young, and they visited the college, and she said, if I ever have a daughter, I want her to come here. I graduated from there in 1954. I studied music there. I wanted to study more performance, but they didn't offer that particular subject in the music school there. So I took music education, which prepared me for teaching music later on. There were so many good things that happened for me in college, and we did a lot of stage presentations. During the last 2 years of my college time, a professor came into the staff who was very, very good with stage presentations of operas, and that made me very happy. I think I got a satisfaction about being on stage through that. At that time, there was a young composer who was becoming very famous, Giancarlo Menotti, and we did several of his operas, and that was really a fine experience. Opera was my main interest in those days, and I really thought I would go on to do that and be a professional opera singer. I don't think I've quite fulfilled that, but I have performed some operas. I did some work in Pittsburgh after graduation with a small opera company there. And that seemed to satisfy me for that, truly. Throughout my college years, I participated in several choruses. We had a large concert choir that traveled around the country during the summers, which was really nice. And then after college, I worked as a music therapist at a mental hospital, as I said before, but I also participated in a choir in Pittsburgh called the Mendelssohn Choir. It was a huge choir and was a really great experience. I really enjoyed doing that. There were some small ensembles that developed from that larger chorus that I belonged to as well. I had quite a lot of close friends, not only in the music department, but a woman, Marg Bischoff, who became a very good friend of mine, and we even became friends, were friends after college and until her death a few years ago. I think I only went to 2 of the reunions. They were fun. I wish I had been able to go to more. My musical training in college has had a very direct meaning on my life and my work, because I worked as a music therapist, as I said earlier, in a mental hospital outside Pittsburgh. And then, of course, I went into teaching and taught for, I think it was about 8 or 9 years in the junior high school, teaching junior high general music classes and senior high vocal music, choruses and ensembles. When I was a child, there was an Italian father and daughter who lived across the street from us, across the road actually, and I would go up to that house very, very often because they had a piano. We did not have a piano at that time, so I got to doodle around on the piano, and Carlotta, the daughter of the family, taught me some Italian words, and I really felt good speaking these Italian words. And one day I came home after having visited with Carlotta for a while, and I said, "Mom, I learned 2 Italian words today." And she said, "That's nice, dear." She didn't ask what were the words. She wasn't excited that I was interested. Definitely not excited that I was interested in the Italian family across the street. But that love for Italian things and Italian men has gone on forever. I'm trying to remember about my first trip to Italy. I have been there twice. The first trip, we visited Rome. I also was able to travel to Florence and visit there, and Milan. When I was in Italy, I was really anxious to see La Scala, and I did travel to Milan, and I went into the theater. There were no operas performing at that particular time, the days that I was there, but they were preparing an opera starring Joan Sutherland, who was, I think, probably at the peak of her career, and I was so anxious to be able to hear her sing. So I was disappointed there were no operas being presented, but I went to the opera house, asked if I could just see the theater, and they explained that the rehearsal was going on, but the gentleman said that he would take me up in one of the balconies and I could listen to a little bit of the rehearsal. And I was so excited because Joan Sutherland was my favorite singer at that time. And so we went up to the second balcony, went into one of the rows, and were standing there very quietly listening to the rehearsal, and I was so involved in what was going on the stage, but suddenly I began to feel a hand, an arm, going around my waist. So I said, well, I think I've seen enough of the opera, and I think we can go now. So we hurried out of the theater, and I went out of that theater very fast. But I was interested enough that the second trip there, I took a job with an Italian family. And I got that job through the church. I had been going to the Presbyterian church in Rome, and I talked to the minister or education director, I don't know which, about work in Rome so that I might live there. So out of the newspaper, we found a family who was looking for an au pair. And so I interviewed with their family, and they hired me. They had three children, and I worked for almost a year with that family. It was one of the best years of my life. I like to think that I had a career as a singer, and I guess I did. I've never been able to live altogether just on earnings from being a singer, but I have done a lot of singing in church choirs and recitals, solo recitals, in not only in my hometown but around the area. I didn't play piano. My mother wanted me to play piano. I was entirely too lazy to practice. And when I discovered singing, that is my expression in music. I didn't really need to play the piano, didn't want to play the piano. Of course, these days, I wish I had and could, but I don't and didn't. That's all. I was just too lazy to do it. I've done odd jobs in summer times. Of course, I taught music for those 8 or 9 years, and I guess I could say that in the summers, I worked in various jobs. I worked for a florist shop, always at Christmas time. That was really nice to do at Christmas time because everybody was always happy when they were shopping and everybody wishing you Merry Christmas and all. You felt really good. And as a waitress, all of us, anybody who's had a singing career, unless they're really, really fine and someone discovers them early on, has worked in a restaurant in order to make a living. So I have done quite a lot of that waitressing. I worked in the summers at Chautauqua, New York as a waitress, and I went there particularly because my professor in music at the college was teaching in Chautauqua, New York in the summer. And so I went there several summers to work with her, to continue working with her. I heard about Subud in a very interesting way. I had been dating a guy during some of my teaching time whose name was Bill Casilli, and he had gone on to New York and was at that time piano conductor for Frankie Avalon, doing very well. And he just, after my trip to Europe and I came back, I was living at home. He happened to have a gig in Pittsburgh, and so he was at home the same time. And we went out, and he said to me, well, what do you want to do with your life? It's a big question. But I said, what I want to do is sing. And he said, well, if you want to do that, you should be in New York, and I'm leaving on Thursday. So I packed up, and I went off to New York, driving with him. And on the way to New York, he told me that he was Roman Catholic, I was Protestant. During our dating time, we argued religion a lot. On the trip to New York with Bill, and he told me about Subud, I thought, oh my goodness, that really sounds weird to me. I'm not sure. that would be anything that I would want to do. It didn't seem quite right to me. And I was very involved still in the church and church activities. So, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I think I thought about it for about 2 years before I was finally opened. And I don't know why, it just took time for me to think that perhaps this was something I might like to look into. And when I did, I was really surprised that it seemed like something I would really like to be doing, to be involved with. I was opened, I believe, in 61. I'm not altogether clear on the year, but around that time. And I was opened in Subud, New York. At that time, I don't know how it's being done today, but at that time there could be a number of helpers at an opening. So I remember Lucienne Farkas, probably Mariana Brody was probably there. I think there were maybe 5 or 6 women at the opening. I can't remember who all. I believe that most of those people have passed away already. Yeah. I just felt something right happening, and maybe a slight movement in my body, but not much. I spent a good deal of time in my early weeks, months, whatever, lying on the floor, doing Laudahan, if that's possible, thinking I was doing Laudahan, but, and all the time realizing that I should be a little more active, but that's the way it was in those days. I believe I became helper in something like 1971. I remember that Lucienne Farkas called me up and said, "I'm so excited because we tested the other night and you should be a helper." And I think I went into a spasm. I thought, I don't want to do that. I can't do that. I really resisted. And I couldn't believe it was happening. I thought, no, couldn't be possible. But I went ahead with it, and I'm really glad I did. My first reaction was something. I remember that I told a friend, believe it or not, I called a friend, I remember now. Just after Lucienne's phone call, I immediately called a friend and I said, "I'm going to tell you something terrible that just happened to me." So that was so strange. I'm trying to remember the times that I met Bob Puck directly, and I think it was only twice. I think I met him in Skymont at that Congress, and then probably in Indonesia when I was there for the World Congress. I was in just a line of people and we shook hands, and that was it. When I first saw Bob Puck, actually the truth is, now this is coming back to me too, that Bob Puck was coming to New York, and Lucienne called me and she said, "Bob Puck is coming to New York, isn't that wonderful?" She was so excited. I could care less. In fact, when Bob Puck was giving his first talk, I went out on a blind date. Because I had seen Bob Puck get out of the car when he arrived in New York, and I looked at him, he had a suit on like every other man that I knew, and I thought, what's so special? I don't see anything special. I'm not sure what I was looking for, but he didn't show it to me at that time, or I didn't see it at that time. Living in New York, there were two or three women who were almost always the women who took care of the family when they came to visit and looked after the apartment that they would be in, changed all the furniture. Some of you will remember all of that. Changed the chairs, brought in new dishes, all sorts of things. Moved out things that were in the apartment and redid it entirely. And there were two or three women who would always do that. And so after a while, I began to think, I would like to do that. And why have I not ever been asked to help with the family when they come to New York? But finally, in the Skymont, when the World Congress was at Skymont, I was asked to help. And it was just a wonderful experience. I could wash dishes and iron Bapuk's handkerchiefs. So that was as close as I ever got to helping with the family. But it was something. I'm looking back at my work as a committee person, and I really enjoyed the helper work once I decided to accept that. And so I kind of felt like I wanted to not get involved with committees because I had done a lot of committee work other places and I just didn't want to do it in Subud. But in Subud you find that the things you don't want to do fall right into your lap. So I think the first job was Secretary of Subud, New York. Don't know how many times I did that. Then I was Secretary of Subud East Coast. And then I worked in the national office while it was still in New York. So I've done as many office jobs for Subud as one can think of. Know that for a very long time, I did Ladahan, I left. I didn't stay after Ladahan to visit with anybody, never went to dinners or anything of that sort. All I wanted was the Ladahan. That was it. So I would do the Ladahan and leave. So I didn't meet a lot of people very early on. I remember Lucien Farkas and Lucien and Ferry. I remember, as I said, Mariana Brody, Livingston Dodson and his wife, Ed Kerner, I remember, and his wife Alphata. I can remember Jerry Chalem. I don't remember anybody else. I remember Verinda, but not as part of Subud, New York. I remember Verinda as part of UN because I worked at an office that was near the UN, and I remember when he worked there, and I remember him as speaking at congresses and meetings, but I'd never thought of him as a member of Subud, New York. I was able to attend a lot of world congresses, and I'm really grateful for that. I was at the Toronto Congress. I was in England. Was that 83, I think? I was in the Congress in Jalandhar. I remember my bus trip from the airport to the compound in Jalandhar. I remember it mainly because of a woman who was on the bus with me. And she was very, very vocal and very busy asking people all kinds of questions about when did they learn about Subud and where were they now and what did they learn from Subud, and being very pushy and asking all these questions that of course we all are interested in. But I was a New Yorker and I thought, oh man, I hope I don't have to be near this woman for my next month. But as it turned out, she was one of my cellmates in the dormitory. So I got to know Dorothy Walmsley very well, and she was absolutely marvelous. I loved her dearly. In fact, I went to England a couple of times to visit with her. She was great. So got to the Congress. I don't remember a whole lot about that. I remember being very impressed with the compound, with the buildings they had prepared for dormitories for us. The other person who shared the little, I don't know, corner with us was Ariane Laidlaw from California, and I'm still good friends with her. I don't remember Ladahans, which is very curious to me. I remember people. I remember just the feeling of being there with everyone who was sharing this time with me. That was mostly what I remember. One thing I know is that I did get sick for a while in Indonesia, and what's new, right? And then I had to stay in bed for a couple of days. So I remember listening to the Ladahan from my cubicle and being so impressed with the sound, how beautiful the sound is of the Ladahan. And that reminds me of an experience I had early on in Subud, New York. I always was late for Ladahan, and I was rushing to get to the Subud house one Sunday, and I heard beautiful singing, and I stopped and I looked around to see where there was a radio in a car somewhere, and then I realized it was the Ladahan I was hearing. It was the women singing in the Ladahan. I'm thinking now, when we were talking about the World Congress, exactly what I felt when the Ladahan began. It was absolutely amazing to me. I had always been in the Ladahan. It was a group of maybe 10 women at the most, 15 really at the most. And when I got to the Congress in Chilandak, it was just amazing. The sound of the Ladahan, the sweep of the sound in the Ladahan. And I've always prepared people that I'm talking to before they're opened about that. It's a very engaging, moving sound. I don't think it happens anywhere else. Even though you can sing somewhere else, it's just very different in the Ladahan. I've been asked to work on the international level in Subud, and I've just said to myself, I've done it. I don't need to go that far. When I lived in Hoboken, New Jersey, that was really interesting. I had been asked by my boyfriend to move to New Jersey, and I said to him, only if I can ever see Manhattan. We got a loft in Hoboken. I had a beautiful view of Manhattan and the whole, actually, lower part of Manhattan and New York Harbor and the river, Hudson River. The building we lived in attracted several people to Subud. The Pinkwaters, who owned the building, were joined in Subud for a while. Daniel and, I can't remember his wife's name, begins with a J. Daniel Pinkwater and his wife, I wish I could owned the building. Anyway, and we're in Subud for a brief while. It was interesting living in that little town of Hoboken. But I worked every Sunday at First Presbyterian Church in New York as one of the soloists in the choir there. So I not only worked in an office in New York 5 days a week, then on Sunday I was in New York to sing at the church. So I like to say that I slept in New Jersey, and I lived in New York. In the loft building on the first floor was a huge space, which was a dance studio when we first moved there. And some people that I knew, Christiana Caleb, one of them, I think maybe came to dance there, may have learned about Subud there. I'm not entirely sure, but it could be so. It was quite a nice space. I think later it became a home for stray animals. Ellis Cameron, with whom I had a partnership for about 25 years, wanted to move to the mountains when he retired. So that time came, and we moved near the mountains, and we moved to Boulder, and we were welcomed when we came here by Chris and Betsy Owens, who were really kind to us. Ellis had come ahead of me, and Chris had showed him around town to maybe choose a house. Found nothing in Boulder that we could afford, but he found a house out sort of in the country, in an area that was just being developed. And so we moved into this house there, where I lived for years until I moved here to Life Care. It was a house in which I could hold Lotta Huns on Sunday. Women would come and do Lotta Hun with me there, and men with Ellis. Ellis worked for a bus company for, it was something like 48 or 9 years, believe it or not. He had gotten a job with his company when he graduated from high school. Then he was enlisted in the Army and served in the Philippines just at the end of the Second World War. He was an extremely talented artist, and because his parents had said to him, well, if the drawings are so good, why don't people buy them? He decided he wasn't very good after all. But the truth is, he was a very fine artist. Never then wanted to consider it as a career or even try to sell anything. I've worked in several office jobs. Don't like that word very much, but anyway, served jobs for Subud, and they've all had their rewards, really. I would encourage anybody to do the committee work as well as helper work when you can for Subud. It's amazing what you gain. I've been in Subud so many years, and I do ask myself once in a while, how can it have been so long? Because it does not seem that long. I've stayed because it works for me. Someone at some music conference where I was once said, well, what does it do for you? And I said, without thinking, I said, it makes me new every time I do the Lotta Hun. I leave it feeling fresh and renewed. And it's the best way I can describe what it does for me. Yes, it's worship. It's many things. It has proved to me to be more what I expect to receive from worship than in the church. A curious thing happened because I was singing in a church choir. Don't remember now where it was, which one it was. But the minister was preaching away, and I think I'd been doing the Lotta Hun for, I don't know, months, maybe years, but I think fairly early on. And I'd usually tried to listen to ministers' sermons, and then I'd drift off, or I'd do something else. I'd do a crossword puzzle or something, as with choir loft, they couldn't see you from the congregation. But I heard the minister say something, and something inside of me said, wow, does he know what that means? And then I said to myself, how come I have a new understanding? of what the preaching was and what they were saying. And I realized that I was gaining a newer understanding of my own religion, my chosen form of religion, which at that time was in the Presbyterian Church. But I still stepped away from it. Why? I don't know. I think when we were here about 2 years, Alice and I decided to have a Christmas party at our house. And so we had a party inviting not only Subud Boulder, but Subud Denver and anybody else in the area. And we did those Christmas parties for the rest of his life, and then I continued to do them after he passed away. He passed away in 1994, and I continued to do those parties as long as I lived in the house. They were just as much fun for me as I think they were for people who came there. I know there are people who still talk about the parties sometimes, and I love it. We sang at those parties. We would finish them with Christmas carols. It was fun to do. You know, I hope that the things that I've said already have given some advice already to anyone who might be interested in Subud, but I think the first thing I would say is what I said before. It feels to me as though I am renewed. I feel fresh after finishing a Ladahan. I feel like a new person. It changes something every time I do the Ladahan. Well, no, that's not true. There are Ladahans that I leave out. I mean, when I don't say that I actually leave, I don't walk out. I leave them in my attention to the Ladahan. My mind drifts away, and it often does, but it will drift back. And I think that that's as much as I could say to anyone who is interested in joining or is doing the Ladahan and maybe not experiencing anything, not feeling anything. And remember, I said early on that it took me a long time before I really, really began to feel something in the Ladahan. I spent a lot of months lying on the floor, and there were long-time helpers who remembered that. It reminded me. I sincerely hope Subud has a future, because I don't know, there has to be somewhere in this world where there is something that provides this way of changing and becoming real and becoming yourself, what you're intended to be. I just sincerely hope that it continues. I've heard a lot of people say that they're not so sure how it's going to go, but when I've traveled to world congresses, I've seen a lot of young people from other countries, and I'm really, really surprised and pleased by that, because it makes me feel that it does have a future. I'm not sure that in our own country there are a lot of young people coming in. I don't know about that. I hope that I'm wrong and that there are a lot of young folks coming on. I've had an experience that gives me an understanding, which I think is real, about life after death. And I can say that it's nothing but beauty and light. I know that I've heard other people mention light, but that's what I experienced. It was after a surgery, and I don't know if I was very close to death, but I experienced something about the afterlife, and it was nothing but light and beauty. So in a way, I'm looking forward to that. In another way, I'm afraid of that big step too. I have both feelings about it. My mother had a very dear friend, and they had been friends since birth, these two girls. And I called her Aunt Alice. Her name was Alice, and I was told to call her Aunt Alice, so I did. But Mother had named me after her. And as much as I loved Aunt Alice, I wasn't Alice. That name didn't feel right to me ever. I never felt comfortable with it. It was like I was wearing a pin on my collar that said Alice, and so I had to respond if ever I heard that word. So I learned in Subud, I learned before Subud that I could change my name. And I was really very anxious to do that, but for some reason, I waited for about 3 years in Subud before I changed it. I made out a list. Bapak gave me, it was when Bapak was giving initials. You'd write him, you ask him if your name was your proper name, and he would send back an initial. I was given a initial I. It's really not an easy initial to find a name for, because we had to send Bapak a list of 10 names beginning with that letter. And I could not, it was so hard. I waited a long time, and it was very hard making a list of 10 names. I thought of maybe 3, and then I had to work very hard. I had heard the name Irina, and I liked that a lot. I thought that's very pretty, and I had put it in the list. So I'm waiting to do number 10 on my list, and I said, change the A, knock off the A, and just write Irin. And I sent off the list. So when my letter came back from Chelandok, and I was so excited to open it up, I opened a letter, and it said, the first line, I can still see it clear as day. Bapak says, your real name is Irin. Those 4 letters, Irin, straight and tall and strong, just went right to my soul, I swear. And I was so happy with the name, and have been ever since. Every time I hear it, I'm grateful. When I changed my name, my mother was a little upset about it, and I can understand why, because Alice, the name Alice, meant her friend and meant a great deal to her. And so she continued to call me Alice for most of the rest of her life. But during the last few months of her life, she would address my letters, Irin Poellot, and she would say, Dear Irin. And it just felt so good to me that whether it made her happy or not, she really had accepted the name and accepted me with that name.